This is Dr. Jillian Hartley, on behalf of Arkansas Northeastern College and the National Cold War Center. I want to welcome Robbie Wade Certain. Robbie's participating in our Cold War Narratives Oral History. It is November 1st, 2024. Robbie, do I have your permission to record?
Yes, you do.
Can you tell us a little bit about when and where you were born?
Sure. I was born in Blytheville Hospital in Blytheville, Arkansas in 1948.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about your family?
My grandfather and grandmother Wade had moved from Parkin and Earl and had been farmers and somehow started a furniture business in 1934. And so my father took over the business after World War II, and so I'm from a long line of furniture and business.
Can you tell me what the Blytheville Main Street in that business district looked like back then?
Well, it certainly didn't have the curvy road. It was a straight street, full of business, many apartments above some of the businesses when I was a little girl. I do remember that. Drugstores. Could always get a good hamburger in Blytheville. Let's see. At one time, when Blytheville was really booming, there were lots of furniture stores in town. But I'm happy to say that Hubbard and Hoke and Wade were the stabilizers. So.
Well, can you tell me a little bit about your school? Did you go to Blytheville School?
Oh, all Blytheville schools. I started at age 5 at Lang Elementary, which is no longer there. It was on the east side of the railroad. I went to junior high right there in the middle, where like it is now, except it was a different building, and then to high school. Well educated. I felt like when I got to Arkansas State, I was prepared.
Good. And when you were young, you're somebody who will eventually become an educator. Was that your goal? Was that your wish when you were young? Did you have anything else you had thought about doing?
Of course, they thought about my running the furniture business, but I was not interested. I had wanted a home ec degree, and I would had to have gone across the river to Martin, Tennessee to get that. But my father could not let his baby daughter go across the river at that point in time.
Well, so you go to college, you come back to Blytheville.
Yes.
So can you made the choice to come back, so can you talk a little bit about why that was?
I came back strictly for family. My father worked a deal and I worked a deal. I decided I would live in an apartment, but I would come back to Blytheville. And I hate to say and admit that I was not sure that was the right decision, but within about 6 weeks of returning home, I met the man of my life, and it was all wonderful again.
Well, and before we get to the man of your life, I'm going to ask, did your dad serve in World War II?
He did.
So you had already some exposure to a military family.
I did, and that's an important piece that I hadn't fully understood until till we shut down for COVID. I read all 436 letters my father had written during World War II. Like most World War II people, he did not talk about it. He would only tell funny stories. And he was a sergeant. He knew how to read and write, and evidently was sought after for a supply sergeant, which he had already been in business with in Osceola. They had a mattress company in Osceola.
So he's somebody who was able to use some of those skills.
Those skills transferred. He did feel like at one point in those letters that he wasn't smart enough to do it because he was in the school with lawyers and those who already had degrees, but he hung in there and did well. And now that I look back on it, I can see why he was instrumental in bringing Air Force Base here, Blytheville Air Force Base. My father was in on the ground floor, and but now it connects. He knew all the paperwork. He knew all the government, the ways in and the ways out, and it made sense to me for the first time.
So since your dad was a part of the big process, what was his full name?
His name was Robert Lee Wade Jr.,
Okay.
and he was instrumental through the Chamber of Commerce to bring the Air Force Base back after World War II.
Well, so you did mention that you came back, and after, 6 weeks, you met Robert. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I actually met him through his connections with Blytheville, with Wade Furniture Company, because he had already bought his furniture from the store and had a relationship, a nice, familiar relationship with one of the salesmen. And he had asked my Uncle Wally, I called him Uncle Wally, where he could find a good girl in Blytheville, Arkansas. And he says, well, if you'll just wait, she'll be home from graduate school.
Now, was Uncle Wally a real uncle or one of those uncles that...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he was not a real uncle, but we loved him like an uncle. And he too, was a World War II vet. And he had also landed at Normandy on D-Day. And he never recovered fully, but he knew how to help my dad.
Nice. So when you married a serviceman,
Yes.
did you have any expectations? What did you think the life might be like?
Well, I knew what the life was like because as a child, I really played between the Air Base children and Blytheville, Arkansas children. I can remember as early as maybe 7 or 8 when the first, not the B-52s, but when they've had the first planes that they had, there was a building complex across from Bush's Canning Company. And there were military people lived in there. So as a businessman, my daddy did a lot of business, and he developed a lot of relationships. So I remember their children, and I played very well with them as well as at the base. I even had my own swimming patch. I mean, I was allowed in all the time because he had VIP status.
Very nice. So what sort of plans did you and Robert make after getting engaged?
Well, I did think I was marrying a B-52 man. And I knew that we would be traveling. And one of the questions my father asked was, how long are you going to be stationed here? Like any typical father. But, well, I was an educator. I was ready to start my career. And, but that didn't happen.
And what grades did you teach, Robbie?
I taught first grade and kindergarten in Blytheville. My love has always been early childhood, and Arkansas State provided that wonderful education for me.
So you're engaged, but
Yes.
then you find out that Robert is going to Vietnam.
Yes. He had already been to Utapau for 4 months, and we had written our love letters through Utapau. But all of a sudden, the big wedding was on hold. The choice was, would I marry him that week, or would I wait 6 months until he returned? And personally, I think it was a God thing because I went ahead and married him by the end of the week. And because otherwise I wouldn't have known about his shoot down. I wouldn't have been included.
The privileges of a spouse.
The privileges of a spouse. I wouldn't have had that support. It really was amazing that it happened that way.
Well, and can you talk a little bit about what kind of correspondence you had with him before before he was shot down? Because Robert was a navigator, correct?
Correct. He was a navigator, and we continued our process of writing something almost every day. And we learned a lot about each other. But there came a letter that said he wanted to get out of the Air Force and go into ministry, and he wanted to be an Episcopal priest. And I wasn't as nice a young bride as I should have been. I really was surprised. First of all, I'd never seen him go to an Episcopal church. I met him in the Baptist church. I had heard him pray and knew he had the skills, but I was in shock for about 2 days.
Okay. So, can you talk a little bit about the circumstances of when you found out that he had been shot down?
Yes. There's several parts to that story. I was at home. It was during Christmas time. Was teaching kindergarten, but it was Christmas. So I knew that our family cook would have chicken on that day. So I went home for fried chicken and to eat with my parents. The first alarm came when Mother picked up the phone rang, and she got off the phone and she said, that was Wally, and he said, some military men have come by the store and they want you to wait at home until they arrive. Well, I was to pick up Robert Certain, my husband, at 2:30 the next morning.
Okay.
So I was expecting my husband home. But when I heard that my father was to stay there, I knew something was wrong. I could not eat my chicken. I was anxious. And yes, the 2 white-topped cars from the military showed up. We opened the door. I knew what it was, but I didn't know how serious it was. Out of respect for my father and what he had done for Blytheville Air Force Base, I had every high-ranking person allowed. They brought 2 cars, probably 10 people. I felt surrounded by men, actually, but anyway, they have to read the letter to you. They cannot just tell you what has happened.
And they can't just hand it to you.
You can't just hand it to you. They have to read it, and it was a letter saying that he was MIA and shot down over Hanoi. And my first question was, why was he flying over Hanoi? Because they had not flown over Hanoi, ever.
And can you remind us what year this would have been?
This was 1972.
Okay.
December 18th of 1972.
And the reason Hanoi would have been...
It's a heavily guarded by SAM's missiles by the Russians. There were Russian communist materials in Hanoi. And they had never flown over there. And the other interesting fact that most people don't understand is they could have been carrying nuclear weapons that night, but they weren't. So that's why Robert was a big deal to Vietnam.
Yeah. It does sound like you had a lot of support, though, from family and community.
I did.
Can you speak to a little bit about how that felt? Because would it have been normal for most people's, for example, father to be told not to leave the house, that kind of thing?
That was, well, in looking back, he was told to wait, which makes me finally realize that they had gone by the furniture store first looking for me, and I wasn't there. Blytheville, well, I'm 21, 22 at this point, and Blytheville was my home, and I had all the support of the neighbors. I had the support of the police department, who sent a car around every night checking on my safety in my own house that we had. The wedding would have been 500 people, which tells you I had lots of support. So all those people were there for me. The school was wonderful to me. Gave me some extra time off till I got my act together, and then I knew I needed to go back to school.
I imagine that was a really hard thing
Yeah.
to do. So when Robert shot down, how did you kind of stay informed about what was going on with him? Did you get any information while that, or did you just have to wait?
We just had to wait. There was not much information. At one point, there was instructions of how we were to send packages or letters that would go through the Red Cross and then go to the prisoners. But none of that worked.
So, you're a young teacher, you're just starting a career. How long was it that you had to wait before you found out he was coming home? And can you just tell us a little bit about, with everything happening, how you were able to press forward?
I pressed forward because of work. I was teaching 2 sessions of kindergarten with about 60 children. So I was busy. But then I accepted a job out at, it was the beginnings of the community college. BB was here.
Okay.
At one time. I've forgotten the little white building, but anyway. I would teach adults about child development, and I would do that several nights a week. And so there just wasn't much time for me to be poor me, and that worked well for me.
So Blytheville was a city long before the air base came. I mean, it was incorporated, I think, in 1870.
Yes.
Yeah. But the air base comes in the 1950s.
Yes.
Of course, it was a strip during the war. But when all this is happening, can you talk a little bit about how you're living still in Blytheville, but there are also women experiencing what you're experiencing on the air base. So can you talk a little bit about the contact you had with them? What were they going through that you know of?
Well, unfortunately, we didn't know about 3 of the men on the crew. The pilot, had 5 children, so his wife was busy. Her life was busy. The next one that I personally knew was, I just went blank. But anyway, I knew her, and she had 2 young children. And we would visit, but we didn't visit much because I was living in Blytheville, and I know it's only 6 or 7 miles, but at that time we were both busy. And the other one, I didn't know at all. So I didn't have the comfort of the base at that time other than the people my parents associated with. And that was honestly a lot. That was enough.
Well, so how did you learn that Robert was going to be released?
The military would call you every time there was a release at all. And if he wasn't on the plane, they would say, "I'm sorry to inform you he is not on the plane." Well, it didn't take long for me to understand that the first in were the first to be released and the last would be the last. And so I had expected it for him to be the last. And he was. He was the last plane out.
Was he chosen as the spokesperson for the group, or was he?
My husband ended up being the spokesperson for the group. And that is because he's able to speak and speak well.
Yeah.
And which then led into the other life.
Kind of probably was hard, though, I would think, him coming home and him having to kind of go through. Was it harder to see a ceremony like that than just have him just come home?
Well, I had to go to Scott Air Force Base to meet him.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I had to go up there, and that was a challenge because you had to have orders from the base, and they had to take you, and it was a process.
So when he gets home, he also then has the journey of trying to be home, acclimate back,
Mm-hmm.
and deal with all of the things that he had experienced there. So,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you?
Well, it was somewhat challenging, of course, and but we did very well in the very initial beginning because the country at that time was supportive of the POWs. They had not been supportive of the war or those who fought it on the ground, and that's too bad. That was a difficult time for my husband, who had only been there 101 days. He felt like he shouldn't be welcomed home like that. But there were many gifts, there were many opportunities, and we took those because he wasn't working. That the military had promised he could go to seminary, and so from April to August he didn't have a job.
Okay.
And so we traveled. And
Was that a normal thing in the military at the time to go to seminary?
no, it was not. Robert was the first.
Wow.
There ended up being two more, but they got that through Robert's ability to get through the maze.
So when looking at that era, did you have any things about the military and the support? And it is an era that you're looking at 1972, 73. It is a period where a lot of people thought Vietnam was winding down and ending.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have just any general reflections, not so much just from the people from the air base, but from that era and the military at the time?
Well, I do realize that the B-52s were tired. They had been a part of the war, but they hadn't been allowed to fight the war. And so for the military people I knew, they were all glad it was over, just plain old over. The piece that needs to be brought up is that in 1972 there was no help, no psychological help for our husbands and wives. We were on our own, and as it progressed, I began to see some issues for my husband, and PTSD eventually became full-blown, but he's been a very successful man.
And a very caring.
And very caring man, very successful. I like to say they're more good than bad.
Well, and you think about it, he sends you the letter, because he wants to maybe do the Episcopal priest route, and he comes home and it seems like he knew for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, he knew for sure.
Yeah.
And what I learned 25 years later at a POW reunion was other POWs said to me, "You do realize we consider him our chaplain." So he used his skills and knowledge, even in war, but he never said a thing about it.
So you do have some post-return relationships with other military families.
Mm-hmm.
So can you give us a few examples of how that maybe nurtured relationships, maybe helped with the process of the return, or just some anecdotes from people you've met?
Well, in the beginning, it was everyone scattered from Blytheville. The ones that were our age scattered. But my parents remained in contact with all the commanders, and I had lots of support that way, but not in terms of the ones our age. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Robert becomes fairly well known in certain circles.
Yes, he is.
Yes, he is. And so I'm guessing he's done a lot of speaking engagements.
I would say I haven't had a Veterans Day or a 4th of July without some event.
So you have a little bit of celebrity there, like, oh, there you. Did you ever get to go to, let's say, the White House?
Oh, of course I went to the White House.
What was like? Give us some details. Who was president at the time?
That was Nixon. He was still in the White House, and we went to the Nixon party that had 1,800 POWs and their significant other. And man, was that special. We were treated with honor, and Hilton, who owns the Hilton Hotels, decided to put everyone up after being in the Hanoi Hilton. So, yeah, we all stayed in nice quarters and ate well, and the tables were tables of 8 or 10, I've forgotten, but just for that table, there was that table and one more was a whole canoe of wine and drinks.
Wow.
my glass was never empty.
Did you meet any famous people while you were there? Or even other places, too? It seems to me that maybe were you able to meet John Wayne?
Yes. I asked my husband to tap on John Wayne's shoulder. I wanted to meet him. And so my husband, who I thought was very tall, was just a little thing, and tapped him on the shoulder, reached up, and he turned around, and we had a nice conversation. He was one of the biggest men at that time I'd ever seen. He was huge.
Was he huge? So is Nixon the only president you've had the opportunity to meet, or were you able to meet others?
Oh, I've met almost all of them up until recently.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my husband actually started with Johnson. He had met Johnson working in Washington.
So who's the last one?
The last one, let's see. Well, I guess Carter. No. Who came after Carter? Reagan.
Yeah.
We actually had the first POW reunion in San Antonio, and Reagan and his wife were still governor, and we were at the head table with them. I'm all of 23, just mixing with all the big ones.
So he was governor, but he was also a movie star, as was she at one point.
So that was. It's hard to describe, but we really have met and been blessed by knowing and experiencing things other people would never have done.
So you have actually come to Blytheville this weekend. You grew up in this area. You know, we're actually recording in Wilson, Arkansas, just south of Blytheville right now. So shifting gears a little bit, because you did grow up in Blytheville Air Force Base, which later becomes Eaker Air Force Base, how do you think having that base there, with just looking back on it, impacted that community?
It was the economy. It was the place to shop, and so the downtown was really booming during my time. I watched many parades. I watched many happy times coming down the main street of Blytheville. But when they pulled out, they did not have a good plan. My father died in 1988, and the base closed in 92. And the community did not understand totally what they had done for the community.
Because it really was a base that's in an area that...
Yes.
Yeah.
And as I'm older now and we live in San Antonio, we have met so many flyers that came through Blytheville, and all of them just loved Blytheville. It was sort of like this was the armpit of the United States, but everyone loved being in Blytheville. It's been interesting to watch. I've even, in the last 7 years, I've seen furniture from Wade Furniture Company.
Really?
In San Antonio.
Oh, wow.
So it's, anyway.
Small world.
I'm sorry that Blytheville was not prepared.
Well, looking back on the Cold War and the sacrifices that people like Robert and you made, ultimately, we're looking at the Cold War. It ends, in part, the base closes because the Cold War ended.
Yes.
So do you have any reflections about the war on communism and what people should take away from that era now that it's been over 30 years since it ended?
Well, SAC, Blytheville was a SAC-based Strategic Air Command, and that command was all about peace because they could drop a nuclear bomb at any time. What I would like to say at this point in my life, and having returned to Vietnam 2 years ago, we need to stay awake, people. We need to stay awake. Our military has diminished beyond words. And I'm telling you, I'm not looking forward to anything happening and would pray it wouldn't. But you cannot guarantee that in this crazy world we live in. I got off the plane in Saigon 2 years ago, and I was so sad to see Russian sickle flags flying everywhere.
I was going to say, you got to go with Robert.
Yes.
To
Vietnam.
Vietnam.
We took 60 some odd people with us on a military officers trip, and we had a wonderful time.
Well, and did you enjoy meeting the people?
Oh, the Vietnamese were wonderful to us. And the last thing they want is a war. They do not speak very highly of China, and they won't speak about them in public.
Well, and I'm going to ask, what was it like going back and seeing where Robert had been held?
Well, all that is there now really is the front. You can, where they entered in, and his part has been torn down. They have a room with concrete bunks, but even that, Robert said, was larger than what they really experienced. They have doors that were like 6 feet deep and with only a little slit. When they clanked that door that day, I just was ill. Many of the wives were crying, and I was having the worst headache of my life.
Well, you did endure so much, and certainly he did too. But one of the final questions I want to ask is that we have a lot of veterans who've returned home from places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and
Yes.
That's been over the last few decades, and many of them are struggling in many ways. And of course, would you have any kind of message, or what can you tell them? Something they can learn from your experience that might help them with the healing process? And I know that's a big question to ask.
That is a big question, but it's the reality. And I would say that one therapy does not fit all. And so it can go from psychological to other types of, or medicines or whatever. But for Robert, it was EMDR therapy, which is one of the newer therapies. Now they even have the visual stuff that we've never seen, but one does not fit all. So don't give up. Just don't give up. Because your spouse is still in there.
Yeah. Well, Robbie, this has been a great interview. But is there anything else that you would like to share with us about, obviously, the experiences that you and Robert went through, or the community, or anything you would like at all before we sign off? Personally,
The Cold War Center has had some difficulties getting started, but I would like to see it done. Blytheville served a purpose in World War II. It served a purpose in Vietnam. It could become active again if it had to, and I don't know that will happen, but I think people need to know what the Cold War was and appreciate the men who did it.
Well, thank you so much for sitting with me today.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.